What's up everyone, welcome back to the channel. So today we're doing another Still Worth It video, and this time around we're talking about probably one of the most important iPhone evolutions ever. So going from one iPhone to the other, I truly think the iPhone 4 was probably the most important designed iPhone ever made. It's between the iPhone 4 and the iPhone 10. Really in between there were just a bunch of small iterations here and there, but the iPhone 4 really, what brought the iPhone lineup to a much more higher standard in terms of design. Functionality, there were some huge functional changes. There were some here, cool things here and there, but mostly it was the design. The design was the one thing that really switched up from the iPhone 3GS to the iPhone 4. And like I said, I think it was the biggest change going from one generation to the other. And I'm really excited to look at it in 2020 because it's actually its 10-year anniversary. This thing came out in June of 2010, and this year in June it will actually turn 10 years old, which is pretty crazy. So I'll probably do another video, around June when this, the anniversary really is, but I didn't even know that until I looked at the specs of this thing. That's so funny. Looking at the front though, we have a 3.5-inch display, and this was the first time we ever saw a Retina display on a phone, and ever since then, every single iPhone that came out after that has had some type of Retina display. But on top of that, that Retina display technology has transferred over to MacBooks, to iMacs, to so many other products. Like, it's so crazy how one little thing that iPhone brought up in their lineup can be transferred over to so many different products. It's so crazy. It is an IPS panel, which is really nice, and that 330 pixels per inch and even that 640 by 960, that resolution is the same that we pretty much had on the iPhone SE and different things like that. Obviously that one is a little bit higher, but the 330 pixels per inch, that's pretty much the same PPI that we have on the iPhone 11 currently, which is pretty crazy, And looking at the front, you can see, it looks kind of like the same from the 3GS, but the biggest thing that this thing brought was that front-facing camera. And back in 2010, there were still phones that for sure had front-facing cameras, but I don't think it was as big of a lineup as you might have assumed. There were still a lot of phones that didn't have that capability. This phone did have that, which was really, really cool. And looking on the sides, you can see a humongous change. We're talking crazy differences. This thing still feels like a very premium phone. There's phones now that don't even feel this premium. Even looking at the predecessor, the iPhone 3GS, that thing does not feel good at all. I have mine and it's just feels like a cheap plastic. It doesn't even feel like a real phone anymore. This one though still feels like a very premium phone. On the back we have a glass back with a single camera setup, and I don't know if I'm going to go too hard onto this because it's really not going to be super functional or anything, but in terms of the design, that is one of the craziest things this phone brought. Such a huge evolution coming from the one version to the other, and even in 2020, like a whole 10 years later, I can still see some remnants of this phone and all other iPhones that are coming out still. Coming from an iPhone, 6 and 7 and 8 and 8 Plus and all those phones. Apple actually eventually brought back in that glass back. They removed it with the iPhone 5 pretty much, and then they eventually brought it back in with the iPhone 8 in that series, and Apple is still selling those phones, so it's pretty crazy. We're seeing little remnants of this phone every which way, which is so cool. So that pretty much covers it up in terms of the outside. I can literally talk all day about the outside of this phone. In terms of software, this thing was released with iOS 4, and that's so crazy to say. Does it even feel like that's even possibly? I can't even remember that far. I was a little kid back then, I think, but still, that's so crazy. iOS 4 is, what did iOS 4 even have? I have to go watch a video about iOS 4 because I don't even know what it brought, but you are able to upgrade it to iOS 7.1.2, and as we all know, iOS 7 was that big UI refresh. They really changed up a lot in that UI. They switched up pretty much everything, and iOS 7 I think was the most important version of iOS in terms of the UI, but the whole functionality and everything kind of broke down a lot of iPhone 4s based off a lot of articles I was reading, based off a lot of things I was reading. A lot of people were having problems with iOS 7, and I kind of say the same thing. There's a lot of functionality that is kind of broken in a way on the iPhone 4 because of the software. I've had a lot of random Wi-Fi issues, a lot of Bluetooth issues kind of currently. When I was just messing with it right now, I have issues connecting to my 5G, which is okay, but my 2G even, it keeps hunting in and out and all that stuff, which I don't know, maybe it's my specific issue or my router. But in terms of the software, obviously this thing's not going to get software updates anymore. It's completely outdated. You might be able to do some weird things here and there to, update it, probably not, but get some more features. There's probably a jailbreak for it. I'm not too sure. But that is really cool, that this thing did get, a couple versions of iOS. Its successor, the iPhone 4S, actually got up to iOS 9.3.5 or 9.3.6 now, which is actually pretty current. But this thing, did stop at iOS 7. A huge disadvantage for the software is that basically 95% of the apps in the App Store are not compatible with iOS 7. And if you're lucky enough to even get an older version of those apps, sometimes they might not even work, with like Snapchat or Instagram. I think Instagram is fine, but Snapchat, if you download Snapchat and you're able to get an older version on your phone, you can't even log in because you have to be on a certain firmware to even be logged in, and that's past the one that you can get on the 4 or even the 4S. So it's kind of like a backwards thing, but it is what it is. It kind of makes sense, So that pretty much covers it up in terms of the software. Now hitting on the performance, okay, this is crazy. This thing had the Apple A4 chip, a single core 1 gigahertz Cortex whatever, and there were 3 different models of the iPhone 4. There was the 8, 16, and 32 gigabyte variant, and all those variants had a whopping 512 megabytes of RAM, so half a gigabyte of RAM. That's how much RAM these phones had, which is pretty insane. And it's actually really interesting to see the shift within 10 years of looking at the storage variants of these phones. I mean, the top tier storage model was 32 gigabytes on an iPhone 4. Now that's barely even the base. I mean, we get 64 for the most part of all iPhones. So think about it, like 10 years of evolution. 10 years from now, I hope we can have like 512 gigabytes be the base model, you know what I mean? So it's probably not going to happen, but a girl can dream. So hopefully that is the case. But in terms of the performance, I think this phone, for what it is, for being a 10-year-old phone, for being a phone that you can probably get for like $15, it's a functioning phone and it gets the job done, which is pretty interesting. But obviously performance-wise, it's not really that good. I wish I was able to get this phone on iOS 6 because based off what I'm reading and based off what everyone's telling me, they told me that iOS 6 was really, really good on the iPhone 4 and that some people are still currently like playing with the device. They're not using it, but they play with this sometimes on the iOS 6 and it's actually not that bad. If I find those comments or I find those DMs, I'll post them up. But I think that's really interesting and I think that's a cool take. But the shame is that if you're already updated, I don't think you can necessarily downgrade back to iOS 6 to get those performance increases. So iOS 7 is what I've been having it on, and on iOS 7 it's really not that good, being honest. I mean, it's kind of what you expect though. I mean, like when I'm opening apps, closing apps, it takes a noticeable amount of time. Real Racing 3 is choppy, which is expected, and basically everything you're going to do with it is not going to be smooth. But if we reverse back and we go back to, let's say, 2011 or 2012 when this phone was still like, in its prime and everything, this phone wasn't that bad in performance. And the reason this phone is kind of bad now is because all of these apps, all these newer apps and all these games and everything are basically being created for the newest iPhones in mind. So they're not keeping, the iPhone 4 in their head when they're designing and programming these apps. They're strictly doing it for the newer apps, and the byproduct is just these older phones get these apps, some of them. So performance wise, it's not good. It's not what you're expecting. But at that time in 2010 when it was released, I don't think it was that bad of a performing phone for sure. But looking at it now, it's definitely not held up. The design is held up, the body's held up, but the performance is not held up for sure. So that pretty much covers that. Now hitting on the camera, this thing has a single 5 megapixel camera on the back. You are able to shoot 720p, HD videos, which is really cool. Like I said, this was the first iPhone to bring a front-facing camera. It was a VGA quality, whatever that is. And believe it or not, this thing was able to shoot 480p on that front-facing camera. And surprisingly, that front-facing camera is super smooth. Like usually when I have like a phone like this or like an older phone, the front camera is so choppy. Like on my Galaxy S4, that front camera is so choppy if I move it around. My iPhone 4, like it's actually pretty smooth, which I'm surprised about. And that back camera is not bad for the price and age of this phone. Obviously, if they release something like that now, if any phone manufacturer even put this back camera on a front camera, I'm sure people would have an uproar. But it's not that bad. Like it kind of gets the job done if you were to. And I think it's actually probably the most average thing about this phone. It's not horrible and it's not bad. In 2020 standards, it's really bad. But for this phone, it's not bad and it's actually held up quite well. So there's really no other way to put it besides me saying it's not bad. I think that's the best way I can complain about it. It doesn't really have too many features on it. No slow-mo, no 720p at 60 frames or anything like that. But it gets the job done. You can take photos if you want to, which I don't think anybody's going to. Now ending it off with the battery life, this thing has a 1420 milliamp hour battery. No wireless charging, no nothing like that, which is kind of already expected. But I do think that the battery life is actually not bad on standby. Like it's actually pretty good when you're on standby mode, which is really cool. But when you're actually using it, I have found my iPhone 4 to kind of go down in battery quite a bit. And I think I attribute this a lot to the battery degradation that's happened on this phone. I mean, within even the first year or two, the phone's batteries probably went down like 5%. But over 10 years, the battery on these phones can go down so much. And whether you like it or not, whether you know it or not, your battery in every device is going down, every single day, unless you replace that battery. And the iPhone 4, luckily, it is easily to replace. You can go replace the screen, the battery, the screen, or whatever you need to. So that's really, really cool, but with the iPhone 4 right now that I have, the battery life really isn't that good. So standby time is good though. That's one thing to keep in mind. But when you're actually using it, it's going down quite a bit. And I think that has a lot to do with my battery. But I don't really think anybody really cares about this because nobody's planning on using the iPhone 4 right now. So to kind of answer the question, is the iPhone 4 still worth it in 2020? I will say, dude, 100% yes. I would keep it not as a main phone at all. If you keep the iPhone 4 as a main phone, do not do that. That's a horrible idea. But definitely having it as a piece of Apple's, timeline of them releasing, and it's like a classic Apple phone. I mean, this thing brought so much to the table, and even if the performance isn't that good, even if whatever's not good, this thing brought the best design we've probably ever seen on any iPhone in terms of the way it feels, the build quality, the front-facing camera, retina screen, and so many other of those things that it's really hard to overlook this phone. So in 2020, do not use this phone at all as a personal phone, but definitely get it as like a classic, timepiece in a way, you know what I mean? Like a collector's item. So that pretty much covers it. If you guys have any other questions or anything, leave it down in the comment section below. Hit that like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it would mean so much if you guys could hit that. Also, check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my second channel, all those links are linked down below. I'd really appreciate if you guys could check it out. But more importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.